There's something about tight, dark places that terrify people. You don't have to have claustrophobia to be horrified at the prospect of getting stuck in a rocky crawlspace, tens of thousands of tons of rocks below and above, ready to cave in at any moment. And if the possible cave-in doesn't scare you, the things that crawl and skitter in the dark might just do the trick. Beware the caves, because today I've got some allegedly true and scary cave-themed stories. Enjoy, and be sure to send us your scary stories for narration at darkstories.org. We're looking for stories about the Boy and Girl Scouts and Colorado monster sightings. Oh, and have you ever read the story of Ted the Caver? If not, I recommend giving that a read. You'll never go near a cave again. Now, let's begin. Cave Dweller, from Darthmonger. Last year, my family and I went camping and hiking. It was a week during the late part of April. My dad always enjoyed getting out in the spring. He also says it gets me and my older sister off the cell phones and computers for a bit. We reluctantly went and tried not to fuss too much, even though I'd much rather be playing PS4 with my friends. If pretending to be excited about walking on some rocks was what it took to keep from hurting his feelings, then so be it. As we prepared for the trip the first morning, Dad and I loaded the truck up with tents, an ice chest, and the other necessary implements for camping. All the while, my mom and sister were arguing over how much to pack for the trip. Thank God my mom won out, because it would have been me having to pack everything into an already overloaded truck. We finally got everything strapped down and started down the road. Our destination was only a few hours away, so it wouldn't be long until we were in a boring supposed heaven. The trip was pretty uneventful. My dad told stories about past trips from when my sister and I were little, and my mom laughed while adding in her own little parts. My sister, being 16 at the time, sulked from her lack of a phone or any other form of entertainment, and I stared out the window watching trees pass by. Apparently, we were going to a new place that Dad had wanted to try for a long time. He didn't know much about it, but a work friend had said it was great. I was hoping it would be more fun than the trips before. Like Mom said, you never know, you might just have fun. Once we arrived at the place, it seemed pretty dead. There was a small playground that looked as though it had been built 40 years ago. The public restroom buildings were run down and didn't seem to be cared for much at all. There was a decent-sized lake in the distance, though, but it too appeared to be empty. For the moment, it seemed like at least, if nothing else, we wouldn't have to share with many people. Dad and I found a good spot and began setting up the tent. He let me pick the spot, so I chose a spot close to the lake. I was hoping to get some fishing in at some point. My mom and sister began putting out the chairs and unloading the truck. By the time we were finished setting up, it was getting a little later in the evening. My dad suggested we go check out the lake, maybe even cast a line in the water. I was more than thrilled to end the day doing something outside I found somewhat entertaining. My mom volunteered herself and my sister to stay and start building a campfire, so it would just be me and my dad. The fishing wasn't great, but I enjoyed it anyway. We did finally see a boat out there, and there were a few other people standing around the shore. It made me a little less nervous. The feeling of us being all alone there was kind of creepy. Later on, we finally made our way back to the campsite. The fire was going, and my mom and sister were sitting in lawn chairs by it. My mom offered us turkey sandwiches. Soon after that, we were off to bed. That night, I couldn't sleep much, Because it was so quiet I could hear every little noise, the crackling of leaves and the rustling of bushes. My 13-year-old mind just knew there was something waiting for me to go to sleep. The next morning, I awoke to my dad yelling, "Wake up, you lazy good-for-nothings. Let's go." I noticed he had his hiking boots on, so I knew we were in for it. He wanted to try a 5-mile trail that had streams, cliffs, and hills. A lot of nature to see, as he had put it. We got started, and there were some cool things to see. Huge gaps in the rocks that seemed to be bottomless and a few small waterfalls. As noon approached, the sky was overcast, and it started to get really humid. I was sweating, and I had already drank 4 bottles of my water. We decided to take a rest, and about the time we were getting settled in, some other hikers appeared behind us. It was a man and a woman and a teenage boy around my age. My dad quickly sparked up a conversation. Soon he and my mom were talking away with them. The other boy introduced himself, and I found out his name was Adam. Adam was 14, and his parents had dragged him out for some fresh air. Apparently, they didn't live far away, and he had hiked on this trail many times before. Finally tired of waiting on his parents, he asked if he could take me to see the caves. My dad asked if it was safe, and Adam's dad assured him it was, and it wasn't too far away. We began to make our way off the trail up a large hill and into some thick trees. On the way, Adam told me that he had been playing at these caves for a few years. He and his older cousins discovered them while on a small camping trip. People weren't allowed to go in them anymore because of young people getting lost and search and rescue having to go find them. Once we arrived, it was actually pretty creepy looking. Brush had grown up in front of the main cave, and it wasn't as large of an opening as I had imagined. He said there were more, but this one was the most interesting because, for some reason, it was so cold when you stood in front of it. He took a rock and threw it in. It made a large echo in the distance. That was obviously the other really cool part to me. So, of course, we kept throwing rocks in and yelling, enjoying all the crazy echoes we were making. Nearby, we found an old rusted bike frame with a bicycle bell still attached to the handlebars. Adam popped it off and threw that in as well. Naturally, it wasn't long before I asked if he had ever actually went inside the cave. He said that he hadn't, and that honestly it was just a little too sketchy for him. He didn't like the dark or enclosed spaces. But I really just wanted a peek, just to see what was inside. I asked if he would stand outside the cave and wait if I went in for a minute. He nervously said he wasn't sure if it was safe, but I assured him I would be careful, and I wouldn't go very far. He finally agreed after a few minutes of trying to advise me not to. I grabbed my small flashlight from my bag and started in carefully. I had to slouch down to get through the opening. Once just inside, I found he was right about the cold. The temperature had dropped at least 15 degrees. I looked around and noticed the cave actually opened up a few yards inside. My flashlight was less than high quality, so it was kind of hard to make things out at first. I figured I would let my eyes adjust for a minute. I made my way to the larger opening where I could stand up. I could see a little better, so I slowly started making my way further into the cave. Adam began yelling, asking what I could see. I responded with, "Nothing yet." As I kept walking, I came to a spot with a large shelf that was in the middle of the path. It was about 5 feet high. I'm not sure why, but I really wanted to see what was on the other side. So I grabbed the edge and began finding footholds to climb up. Once on top, the path got really low and narrow. Adam started yelling that we should be getting back. I told him just another minute as I got down and began to crawl through the small space. I'd been crawling for a few minutes when I started to get a little scared. It had gotten really cold. It felt like the air was getting thin. I realized the space was too small and I could not turn around. I crawled just a little further, and finally there was another opening. I stood up and stretched. I was about to crawl back through when I could have sworn I heard a small whisper. I used my flashlight and looked around quickly, but I had stirred up so much dust getting up. The lighting was so poor too, I could barely make anything out. It was about that time I felt something brush lightly up my shoulder. I broke out in goosebumps. It was time to get out of there. I got down on all fours and began trying to climb back down the tunnel. My backpack got hooked on a sharp rock, and I was freaking out so bad, pulling it so fast it wouldn't come undone. That's when I heard a ring, ring. I couldn't promise it, but I was almost sure it sounded like a bicycle bell. I let go of the backpack and began to crawl. I was moving so fast, so tensely. It made getting through the narrow passage feel like walking through quicksand. I was losing my breath and had to slow down. As I caught my breath, just as I was about to relax, I felt a cold hand grip my ankle. It felt like, for a second, something tried to pull me back. This gave me new energy to escape that tunnel. Once I got to the ledge of the shelf, I couldn't find a quick way down. I turned around and began to dangle my feet over the edge. As I looked up, my flashlight in my right hand pointed forward, because I was holding onto it and the ledge too. About 10 feet down in the tunnel, I saw what looked to be a face. It was pale, clammy. The figure had long, dark hair and the face was grimaced, like someone who had died in agony. The small light from my flashlight glared off of its teeth. I let go and fell, landing on my back. The wind was knocked out of me. I jumped and ran to the entrance with tears in my eyes. As I came out, Adam was standing with our parents, who had just began questioning about my whereabouts. My dad saw my face and grabbed me, asking what happened, asking if I was okay. I didn't want everyone to laugh at me, so I began telling them that I got lost and I had fallen. After telling me how stupid I was, my parents took me back to camp to assess my injuries. Deciding that I just had some bumps and scrapes, they kind of calmed down. After that, I begged to go home, because I could not stay the night there, knowing what was in that cave. Seeing that horrible face, it had traumatized me. After my begging, they finally gave in and took me home. I'm not sure if what I saw was real or not. I'd like to believe it was just my imagination. Bad lighting, a scared kid, but I can't get that grimaced, dead-looking face out of my head. I don't do tight spaces anymore, and cave dwellers can have their caves all for themselves. Disembodied noises at the Ape Caves, Mount St. Helens. From Nordic Nonsense. I like to go spelunking. It's one of my favorite hobbies, and I live for the adventure. Me and my friend Josh decided to go up to the Ape Caves outside of St. Helens and go walking around and explore the old lava tubes. For those who don't know what a lava tube is, it's a super long, one single tunnel that was created when lava came down through the underground super quick. They were formed thousands of years ago, and it's always a blast to go and crawl through them, trying to find your way through. Some parts do get really sketchy, because you have to duck, climb, and basically be a spider monkey through. But I digress. So we went up pretty late in the season. We're talking mid-November, early December. This was back in 2014, so the details are a little sketch. It was pretty late when we got there, and we were the only car in the parking lot. We gathered our gear and headed down the trail to the actual mouth of the caves. The air was super heavy and humid in the cave, and as we walked through, our footsteps were the only thing you could hear. Josh also brought his dog along, and it happily plodded along right next to us. We were about an hour into our expedition when Josh suggested we turn our lights off to see just how dark it actually is. The lights go out, and we stand there in silence. It's moments like those that really just remind you how vulnerable you are. I would not want to be here by myself. That's when I could hear the deep rumble of a growl in Josh's dog's chest. Josh quickly switched his light back on, and in the distance, we could hear someone talking. It wasn't loud, just enough to get our attention. Savage, the name of Josh's dog, starts barking like mad, and he tries to shut her up. Chills are racing up and down my body as we quickly turn back and head the other way. The entire way out, I could swear I heard footsteps that weren't our own, as if a third person had joined our party. Every now and then, you could hear the same voice, talking and laughing. But this wasn't a sane laugh. There was madness in it, that mocking high-pitched mirth. We got the heck out of there, and by the time we got back to the parking lot, we were both panting heavily and covered in sweat. We didn't talk about that experience for the rest of the car ride home. Now, I love spelunking and exploring, but not when I gotta do it with spirits. Cave in the Woods, from LaughingJack. I'm 22 going on 23 years old now, and this happened when I was 6 or 7, living with my birth mother and her mother, which would be my Nana. It was the middle of June, and it was a hot summer day in West Virginia. I lived in the mountains where our backyard was a forest. Me and my 4 brothers, 2 older and 2 younger, would go hiking in the woods behind our house all the time to pass the time. On this particular day, it was about 97 degrees Fahrenheit out and sunny as we trekked through the woods. After about 30 minutes of hiking, we came across this cave. It was the most peculiar cave, because in the opening, there seemed to be a pillar of ice, despite the extreme temperatures. As my brothers approached it, trying to figure out how it didn't melt, I noticed the woods got silent. I was a bit of a wuss back then. I got scared easily. My 2 older brothers often picked on me for this. Well, I told them that I was wanting to go back home, and they told me to go back by myself if I was so scared. So being the stubborn kid I was, I did just that. As I was walking back home, I saw what appeared to be a deer off to my left. When I looked over, it was a doe, but it was a doe unlike any other I'd ever seen. This doe stood 7 feet tall on all 4s. The only place I'd ever seen an animal so big was a zoo. So being the scared little boy I was, I ran back home and cried in my room until my mother came in and calmed me down. Eventually, I passed out. The following night, I woke up to a horrifying and confusing sight. I rolled onto my back in bed and looked out the window. And there I saw eyes. Immediately I knew I'd seen those eyes before, but then I really grasped what I was looking at. That massive 7-foot doe was standing by my window, looking in at me in my bed, expressionless, emotionless. I ran terrified into my big brother's room, sleeping on the floor because his room didn't have a window. I never ventured back into that forest after that, and I can't help but think that wasn't a normal doe, and that perhaps that icy pillar had been a distraction to get me alone. The following story was previously narrated on its own, so it didn't get as many listeners, but it's a great story that matches today's topic. I thought you'd enjoy it. Eisen Wolfen Tunnel, from Cyanide Kitty 101. Where I'm from in rural Germany, we have a local legend about a tunnel that runs through a thin but steep mountain called Eisen Wolfen Mountain, or Iron Wolf Mountain. This short but inconvenient landmark is what now separates my small town from the larger colony and what used to be my school. Back in the early 1980s, when I was a young boy, it was my own responsibility to get to and from school on time by riding my bike, and I was also tasked with picking up any items from the stores to bring them back home. Now, normally this would not be a problem, as I could simply, on most occasions, detour around the mountain on a much more public road. However, one dusk, I had to be home quickly, before it got truly dark, in order to avoid getting into trouble and probably a beating by my less than nurturing father. The road I normally took curving around the mountain was easily a 35-minute ride. This meant I had no choice but to take the tunnel. But before we get into my experience, let me tell you about this tunnel. Eisen Wolfen Tunnel can easily be described as a maw carved crudely into the rocky face of a sheer cliff, reddened with strips of iron deposits. From the outside both ways, a not-so-well-worn dirt path branches off of the paved road and slides into the dark interior of the Earth's cave. Supposedly, the main tunnel is a straight shot through, but if that were the case, then you would be able to see light peeking through the other side, right? Not here. Instead, it's pitch black, mere meters into the threshold. The history of the tunnel is a strange but no all too uncommon one. During World War II, the tunnel was carved into the mountainside as a means of more readily transporting supplies to stationed troops. In addition to this, it was also given branching tunnels from within to mine the vast quantities of iron used for the manufacturing of weapons and other items for the war effort. This may be to blame for the tunnel's lack of straight shot through, most likely curving some due to the iron harvesting and crude explosive methods the workers tended to use when creating the tunnel. Now, with that bit of history out of the way comes the part that skeptics may choose to overlook, or make reason to. The tunnel itself was abandoned shortly after its completion, and mining efforts ceased. There is no documented reason for this happening, other than those who entered it simply began to vanish. No traces were ever left behind. It never mattered how many people went in at a time. If they had weapons, and being Germany during the war, you know they had weapons, nor how long they were supposed to be inside. Even if they had lights with them, a few documented accounts of those outside and watching say that the darkness of the tunnel snuffed the light out in an impossible way, consuming it and the men who entered. Along with this, no sounds of screams or struggles were ever heard from outside. Everyone who went in simply disappeared without trace or reason. As such, the tunnel and mining operation from within were abandoned, the war losing more people to the mountain's mystery than what resources were worth gathering. That being said, since then, more and more people have gone into the tunnel and have been lost, but not all. On occasion, a person, adult or child, it doesn't matter, will claim to have gone into the mountain and made it completely through the tunnel. However, when they do this, it's quite clear that portions of their mind were left behind. Eventually, kids started to dare each other to go into the tunnel's shadows and stand there for 5 minutes, or was used as a sort of rite of passage. This led to more disappearances by some, but not all, folks who chose to perform the task, which in turn prompted the local government to put up wooden blockades and signs warning people not to trespass, ineffectively closing off the tunnel to anyone who might want to go in. This didn't work for me. As I said before, I had to be home soon one dusk to avoid my father's temper. This meant that by the time I'd gotten to Eisen Wolfen Tunnel's poorly blocked off entrance, the moon was already climbing its way into the sky. Being a 13-year-old boy and not wanting to take the extra 35 minutes to get home by going around the mountain's edge, I quickly decided that I would try the tunnel for the first time. I knew of the stories and was well aware of the traditions of leaving people inside for fun, but I can honestly say that fear of my father's beating vastly outweighed the fear of a local legend and dark cave. Pretty bad when you're more frightened of your own father than the thought of possibly vanishing, huh? Anyway, I made up my mind rather quickly and mustered up what courage I had to enter the tunnel. Luckily, I'd brought a headlamp with me, just in case. It was a simple elastic band with a mini light on the front that went around my head's circumference. Turning that on, I hopped off my bike and walked it carefully past the haphazardly placed blockades and crept into the tunnel. Just as I had imagined, the inside was crudely torn out of the mountain's rocky flesh, and darkness enveloped me and my bike. I didn't get back on due to the mystery of what lay ahead, unwanting of speeding through and inadvertently crashing into a wall or flipping over the handlebars due to a jutting stone. Besides, even if I took my good old time here, I would still make it through the other side and just outside my hometown in mere minutes, in theory. As such, I gradually pushed my bike along step by step, heart pounding and palms sweating. The sound of dripping water caused my head to jolt to the side many times in a short time frame, eliciting dizziness and an aching neck. But every sound was amplified, and I perceived it as something to watch for and fear. I'd only been walking for a couple of minutes when the fear that had been welling up inside of me burst the fragile dam of confidence I tried to cling to. It was just all too much, even though nothing truly terrifying had happened yet. All I had seen were the red-orange walls scored with marks of forgotten miners and a few pools of murky water. No monsters, no missing bodies, nothing but the cave itself and blackness. But it was this blackness and the thought of the stories I'd heard that clutched my cowardly child heart, holding it with a fierce grip that I turned into energy to fuel my haste to leave. I held my bike's handlebars tightly in my hands and whipped around with the contraption, turning my back to the cavernous way. However, upon spinning, I saw no light from the outside, not even the dim brightness of the moon's illumination. The only thing my dim headlamp showed was more tunnel wall. Heart skipping a beat, I bit my lip and raced back the way I had come with my bike still in hand. But I only came face to face with a damp wall. Where I had been certain I'd come from in a straight line was only wall. No entrance, no blockades, no outside. Panic truly began to set in then, bubbling up like an overflowing cooking pot. I ran along this wall to the left with my bike until it met with another to form a rounded corner. Upon seeing this, I tried the other way but was greeted with the same thing. Somehow, it appeared the tunnel's entrance had sealed up, like a healed wound, and that meant I was sealed inside. Sure, I had not taken any turns. My mind boggled at the idea of being unable to find my way out. It raced at the time with all the stories I'd hear, the legend, and how I cursed myself for being such a fool. Now I would become just another story. Another child, suddenly lost without a trace, consumed by the tunnel. I'm not ashamed to admit I started to cry then. I gripped my bike's handlebars harder and wailed, the sound of my desperate yet defeated cries echoing loudly across the interior. It drowned out all the other sounds of the tunnel, causing my ears to flood with the noise and ring. I cried for some time, but I cannot tell you how long. I can only say that by the time I'd come to terms with my fate, my throat stung with effort. By then, I'd collapsed onto the cold ground with my bike lying to the side. My hands and clothes were wet, but not from the water falling above, from my own source. I sat there for maybe a minute, contemplating how long it would take for me to really die in this forbidden place. But then, what little will I had left to live emerged, and with it came a sense of logic. If I didn't have a way out the direction I'd come, maybe I'd have a chance to get through to the other side. After all, others claimed to have done it before, even though they never spoke of being trapped inside beforehand. Still, this was a tunnel, and tunnels always had another way out on the other side. It would be my only chance, but it was a chance. Mustering up what energy I had left from breaking down, I hauled myself to my feet and gathered my bike. Quickly, the remaining tears upon my face were wiped away by a sleeve, and I inhaled deeply, exhaled, then slowly began to move forward. This time I stayed along the wall, instead of following the open path made. I figured this way I'd be able to tell when the tunnel took a turn, or when it branched off, so I could steer clear of it if possible. I hoped so, anyway. Step by step, I headed deeper into the mountain's stomach, the walls going from high and mighty to a more enclosing space. I perceived no turns, so I thought that maybe since the tunnel had been abandoned, they hadn't fully carved out the high ceilings before everything was lost. This brought little comfort, though. What made things even worse, yet more fascinating, was when I came across a small pile of old pickaxes lying at the base of the wall I walked. They were clearly from the war's efforts. The wood almost rotted completely away from years being in heavy, humid air, porous and nearly like shriveled sponge. The metal heads were rusted greatly, deformed by the oxidation, and a thick coating of dust blanketed it all. For a moment I stopped to stare in wonder and caution, having almost tripped over the sudden collection in my small circle of luminescence. How many people had been down here working on the tunnel? How many after had come to see remnants of the past such as this? Judging by the undisturbed dust, I would say not many. Perhaps I was the only one to witness these relics for decades. Even so, even in my moment of wonder, I knew I had to press forward. So I left the pile as it was, undisturbed by anything of the outside world. Continuing on, I began to notice various other objects lying about. Hammers, hinges, lanterns, even a small metal box all lay scattered throughout the tunnel's interior and somewhere in my path. Then came the worst thing I could have come across. After walking for what felt like a mile, I was met face to face with another wall, a dead end tapering down into a rounded point with walls pressing close to my personal bubble. But how? I thought. I'd been watching where I was going, and the wall I'd followed had never taken a turn to my perception, not even a gradual one. How was I at such a clear end that wasn't my destination? In hindsight, I suppose the long-forgotten tools should have been my clue that I had deviated from the main tunnel and went down instead a mining shaft. But at the moment, I hadn't thought of the tools. I only let out an aggravated yowl and carefully turned myself and my bike to head back the way I'd come, and hopefully, I'd find the main tunnel again. I walked and walked, following the same slick surface I had before to go back. But no matter how much I stepped forward, I never seemed to really go anywhere. The tunnel all looked the same, walls and ceiling close, stretching further onward in what looked like a straight shot into everlasting darkness. Yet never again did I find those hammers and hinges and lanterns. Never did I regain sight of the pickaxe pile, even though I'd retraced my path exactly the way I'd come. Suddenly, the light of my headlamp caught the sheen of something truly awful. At the edge of its golden radius, a weathered but clearly discernible length caught my attention. Shakily, I looked onward, slowly panning the light upon my head further up the object. A skeleton's leg led to tattered pants, which led to a ripped shirt that connected upwards to a torso and beaten skull slumped against a jutting rock. It's safe to say I let out the beginnings of a scream, but the reverberation hurt my own ears, so I covered my mouth firmly with both hands, allowing my bike to clatter over in the process. Before me rested the ancient skeleton of what I can only assume to be a soldier of the war, given his dark green shirt and gray pants uniform, no matter how tattered and torn. He sat there against the rock and wall, leaning with his half-skull nestled into the nook naturally formed. An arm rested merely at his side, while the other unfortunately held a small pistol. It was then that I noticed nearby was his helmet, a bowl now for containing the dripping water, rather than protecting his head, or what was left of it. Why had he done this to himself? Had he gone insane during the war? Or had he been trapped in this mountain like I was now, unable to find his own way out in the twisting, shifting cavern walls? I shuddered to think what had been going on through his mind before it was destroyed by his own hand, vividly able to imagine his own prior terror and hopelessness. I prayed then that I wouldn't suffer the same fate, being trapped so long that I wished for death as a means of escape. I left his remains alone, allowing the dust to further accumulate over his bones without interruption. Picking up my bike, I stared at the bare corpse, a small part of me waiting for it to reanimate and lunge for my legs or arms, as if some kind of nightmare which would never end. But as you can expect, nothing happened. It never moved, and I moved on, slowly. By then, my stomach had started to growl, gnawing at my conscious mind to find something edible, but I knew there would be nothing here, in this cave. What had once been food years ago would have then been more accompanying stone. I hadn't even seen any bats or another living creature at all since first entering the tunnel's gape. Yet my hunger persisted, forcing my mind to wander and remember delicious meals of roast veal, the salty broth of eintopf, and sweet essence of black forest gâteau cakes. This led my brain to think of my poor mother. She would be worried sick when I never returned home, when I never received another embrace in her loving arms. While father would be furious, she would be sobbing with worry. Guilt settled, and I wished then more than ever that I had just taken the road around the mountain to be late getting home, in that tunnel, being stuck wandering in the chill and black void for what had definitely been hours, seeing relics of the long-forgotten past, and finding the final resting place of a soldier trapped as I was. I wished for the beating from my father. That was nothing compared to the hell I'd been facing inside of that dreadfully atrocious mountain. It was then that I noticed something new in my path. Once more, having followed the wall the way I had come, Eisen Wolfen tunnel had shifted. Instead of the mine shaft opening up into the main tunnel, I was faced with a choice. Branching to the left straight ahead, and to the right, were 3 smaller tunnels, each one leading only further into the abyss. By then, I had come to terms with the fact that retracing my steps was useless. The worthless paths I tried to retake never ended up back where I'd come from. I had no choice but to go forward in this endeavor, or simply sit for death as the soldier had done. With the second option not yet viable, I chose to press onward. I used a simple tune akin to Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo as a means of random selection, eventually opting for the tunnel on the right. Gradually, I entered, bike still by my side. I don't know why I still kept onto it at that point in time. In the squeezing expanses I found myself constantly traversing, the bicycle had no use. I couldn't ride it, not also with the shadows closing in and paths so uncertain. Perhaps it gave me a sense of familiarity. Maybe it was the only thing keeping my childish, draining mind on the task at hand. Maybe it was the only thing keeping me sane. Either way, I never left that thing behind, nor held it any more away from my body that its bar couldn't slightly dig into my moving hip. Along this span of particular tunnel, I found the ceiling going up, then pressing back down in waves, as if it mimicked the wave of an ocean. The walls, however, always stayed the same, bending here and there in close quarters but never truly making a solid turn. Imagine my exasperated surprise when that hole opened up to allow my headlamp to shine onto the familiar, distressing sight of the deceased soldier, sitting against the stone. Quickly and without much thought, I raced back down the tunnel I'd been to previously, continuing past the decrepit bones as I had once done, and landing myself back at the interesting tunnels. This time I went left, and to my unfortunate exacerbation, I landed right back in the same spot, the soldier before me once more. It seemed the more I moved, the less sense the mountain made. How could a single tunnel with no other branchings lead to the same exact spot from the same exact perspective as another? Logic didn't exist anymore. One last time I tried my luck and took the tunnel down the straight middle. It stretched deeper and deeper but never curved. I swear this one never curved to the left or right. If I had had something to shoot down the center, I know it would have traveled far before ever hitting a wall. For minutes I walked until the ground started to slope downwards, at a rapid descent, taking me even more beyond reality. And yet I let it. I carefully inched my way down, placing each step of my shoe hesitantly upon the slick, angled ground. At first, it wasn't so bad. I made it a good way down without incident, and then my foot slipped. With it, I was sent tumbling down. My bike, which I had been clutching onto tightly at my side and slightly behind me, coming down after me. I rolled quickly with a yelp, hitting my body in various places off the rocky surface, and most definitely having my bike smash into my teeth, causing a bloodied chip to be born, before plunging into a deep pool. I was submerged, instantly soaked to the bone and gasping for breath, only to have disgusting iron-rich fluid fill my mouth and nose. Like a fish out of water and a boy in it, I flailed, desperate for something I needed to fill my lungs and to find the surface. I swear to you, while I was under and panicking, something touched my arm. Actually, a lot of somethings touched me. What I can only describe as many hands of various sizes grabbed my body and they pushed me up. My head finally broke the surface tension, and I gasped loudly. By the light of my now flickering headlamp, I swam the short distance back to the slope I'd come from, sure it was the same one by the fresh gouges my bike's metal handlebars had scored into the stone on our way down. I clambered up into that little shore and heaved, coughing up foul liquid and feeling the sting of many cuts and scrapes fresh on my body. I didn't even try to find my bike, as I knew it was lost forever in the depths. I simply instead spread my arms and legs to press my feet and hands firmly against the narrow tunnel walls to climb my way back up the slope. As soon as I made it back up, my headlamp's then much dimmer, fading light caught it again. I wailed as the entire span of that tunnel I had traversed before had been erased on my return, along with one of the other branching paths, leaving only two. Finally, I curled up next to the dead soldier, at last defeated by this god-forsaken tunnel. Without touching the bones, I drew near and slumped against the wall, as he did, then cried once more, my lamp completely going out. Fully engulfed by the void, shivering from the cold, drenched and exhausted, I accepted my defeat, broken as a glass vase dropped on wooden floor. For a long time I cried again, eventually curling up into a ball with knees to my chest and arms wrapped around, head down. I bawled my eyes out in the darkness, eyes unable to adjust with no light left and tears blocking vision anyway. It was there that I subjected myself to the thought of true death. I would never escape this hellish encampment. I would never again see my mother or receive her kisses or hugs. I would certainly starve here, or perhaps die of infection from my many fresh wounds that would go untreated. Either way, the light of day should never more bathe my body or grace my sight. No light would. Even my own wails and heartbeat would be the only indication the nightmare wasn't over, the soldier my only other companion. In the silence long after my fit, I heard it shattered by something other than my heart and steady cave drips. Footsteps, clear as day. Footsteps echoed, bounding off the walls in a calm and steady pace, heading directly for my location. My heart nearly leapt, threatening to burst from my ribs as I rose my head from between my knees to see a faint glow of orange progressively growing near. However, barely any thoughts crossed my mind. I could only think either I would have someone else who was trapped to die with, or just maybe I would finally wake up from such a horrid dream. Within moments, he was upon me, the light of his lantern burning my darkness-adjusted eyes. I raised my hand to block some of it out, but through squinted eyelids, I saw his black boots giving way to neatly tucked gray pants. In German, he spoke to me. German being my first language, I understood every word. But he had a defining accent of the likes I could not put my finger on. It sounded almost like the accent my grandfather spoke. He asked me if I was lost, to which I simply nodded, unsure of what to actually say, or if I was even able to speak anymore from a throat raw with wailing. In response to my nod, he smiled, and I saw this from my eyes finally adjusting to his lantern light. Letting my hand fall, I gazed up at a young man in a soldier's uniform. His stubbly face was narrow and supple, no doubt showing an age of around merely 18 to 20 years, with brown hair poking out from under a textured helmet. Blue eyes gazed down to my surely beaten, dirty form with a soft warmth, and the corners of his mouth pointed slightly upwards. With his free hand, he gestured for me to get up, and I did, never taking my eyes off of him.
"Kommen,"
he simply said to me, then turned and began to walk away. With nothing else to go on and curiosity growing with a newfound hope, I followed him at a limping pace. He headed to one of the branching tunnels, the one I'd come from after spilling into water and nearly drowning, and the other that remained but had once been the leftmost tunnel. The soldier glanced back at me with that smile still adorning his face, and he headed into the left tunnel. With nothing left to lose and not even caring for my life anymore, I followed. We wandered wordlessly through the stone corridor for some time, the tunnel having now somehow shifted to wind to the right and then the left, going up gradually a ways and then back down before once more waning to the right. All the while, the soldier never once turned to look back at me, but the obvious sound of my footsteps pattered behind his with a distinct squish sound from being waterlogged. I never broke the silence myself either, exchanging no words with this man but merely trailing along behind him and keeping my eyes either on the back of his mostly shaved, capped head or on the flickering glow of his lantern's flame. Eventually, we rounded a final corner, and miraculously, I saw more light. Up ahead, perhaps a mere 30 meters, the sun shone brightly into the tunnel's form, pink and new. At first I thought it a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by false hope and delirium. Then the more I gazed, the more details of the outside world came to me. Trees along the right side swayed as they created a forest with vast undergrowth, tangling and stretching out onto the dirt path. Beyond that, following the path, I saw the paved road meet it and turn off towards my small town. Buildings in the far distance as the sun peeked in from the left, rising high rather soon. Frankly, at first I felt no joy, but seeing those trees, that road, the structures, and the light, what little ember of hope I'd somehow had left in my ragged body grew to the size of a roaring blaze. I shared no words with the man who led me there, and opted instead to mindlessly run towards the outside world ahead. 25 meters, 20 meters, 15, 10, then 5, I broke through the tunnel's consuming maw, bursting forth from the darkness to be gratefully bathed in warm splendor. I can tell you now the sun on my face that day blinding my tired eyes was the best feeling I'd ever felt. Despite my still wet and chilled figure, the aches in my joints and stinging on torn skin, I smiled. No more tears left in me, and face and throat sore from crying so much before, I didn't weep. However, had I the ability to, it surely would have come to occur. I was nearly home, but I was absolutely free. In one swift motion, I spun on my heels to turn back to the accursed tunnel with intention of thanking my rescuer, but he was nowhere to be found. I had expected him to follow me out of the darkness, but he simply never had. I didn't hear any footsteps echo away, and I no longer saw the life-saving light of his lantern. He was simply gone. For what it was worth, I mustered my strength and rasped aloud, "Thank you," into the abyss, the words faintly coming back to my own ears. If he was still in there, I hoped he had heard. With every fiber of my being frayed, I drug my feet back home. Upon opening the front door to my small hovel, I was instantly greeted by my worried sick mother, who scooped me up into her arms and hugged and kissed me like she never had before. Father, thankfully, was away at work at the time. I'd still received my beating that night for having been gone so long, apparently the entire night, but I was never more happy to be home. In the end, I never procured my beloved bike back, but there was only so much I could be upset about it. I had made it home with my life, though my mind was forever scarred by what I'd experienced in Eisen Wolfen tunnel. The true raw terror, the confusion, the pain, it still has not left me, and most likely never will. But I shall live with it, for I'm alive. I'm thankful to be so. Looking back, I'm not certain that the man who had saved my life was even real. A large portion of my soul wants to believe he was that soldier I'd found slumped over in the dark. I want to say he had never found his own way out in life, but heard my distress and took it upon himself in the afterlife to guide me to freedom. Perhaps he has done this with others before, and may do so with those in the future, willing and stupid enough to enter such a cursed existence in space. Since my incident, I've never returned to the tunnel, nor do I even consider going nearer than I must to traverse the tar road around it. But every once in a while, on my way by, I will gaze into the all-consuming grasp of shadow with gratitude for that soldier, and mouth another "thank you," hoping he may just see it. Believe me or not, that is your call to make. I will, however, swear by this tale, and I warn any who may dare to think of entering that tunnel to not be so wasteful of life. Nothing you could step into that tunnel for is worth it, especially not time that would be much better spent simply taking the road around. Don't be like me, for if you ever are so impatient or so scared to be late, know that your life and sanity are worth so much more.